Chapter 23. They must be approaching. Within a stone's throw, Kunta sensed a recently cut bamboo grove. Through his hood, he could smell the rich fragrance of bamboo freshly chopped. They marched closer. The smell became stronger and stronger. They were at the barrier, then through it, but they were still outdoors. Of course, it was a bamboo fence. Suddenly, the drums stopped and the marchers halted. For several minutes, Kunta and the others stood still and silent. He listened for the slightest sound that might tell him when they had stopped or where they were, but all he could hear was the screeching of parrots and the scolding of monkeys overhead. Then suddenly, Kunta's hood was lifted. He stood blinking in the bright sun of mid-afternoon, trying to adjust his eyes to the light. He was afraid even to turn his head enough to see his Kafo mates, for directly before them stood stern, wrinkled senior elder Sila Badiba. Like all the other boys, Kunta knew him and his family well, but Sila Badiba acted as if he had never seen any of them before. Indeed, as if he would rather not see them now. His eyes scanned their faces as he would have looked at crawling maggots. Kunta knew that this surely was their Kintango. Standing on either side of him were two younger men, Ali Sise and Soru Tura, whom Kunta also knew well. Soru was a special friend of Amoro's. Kunta was grateful that neither of them was Amoro to see his son so scared. As they had been taught, the entire Kafo, all 23 boys, crossed their palms over their hearts and greeted their elders in the traditional way. "Peace, peace only," replied the old Kintango and his assistants. Widening his gaze for a moment, careful not to move his head, Kunta saw that they stood in a compound dotted with several small, mud-walled, thatch-roofed huts and surrounded by the tall new bamboo fence. He could see where the huts had been patched, undoubtedly by the fathers who had disappeared from Jafur for a few days. All this he saw without moving a muscle, but the next moment he nearly jumped out of his skin. "Children left Jafur village," said the Kintango suddenly in a loud voice. "If men are to return, your fears must be erased, for a fearful person is a weak person, and a weak person is a danger to his family, to his village, and to his tribe." He glared at them as if he had never seen such a sorry lot, and then turned away. As he did so, his two assistants sprang forward and began to lay about among the boys with limber sticks, pummeling their shoulders and backsides smartly as they herded them like so many goats, a few boys apiece, into the small mud huts. Huddled in their bare hut, Kunta and his 4 mates were too terrified to feel the lingering sting of the blows they had received, and too ashamed to raise their heads even enough to look at one another. After a few minutes, when it seemed that they would be spared from the further abuse for a little while, Kunta began to sneak looks at his companions. He wished that he and Sitafa were in the same hut. He knew these others, of course, but none as well as his Yayo brother, and his heart sank. But perhaps that's no accident, he reasoned. They probably don't want us to even have that small comfort. Maybe they're not even going to feed us, he began to think, when his stomach started to growl with hunger. Just after sunset, the Kintango's assistants burst into the hut. "Move!" A stick caught him sharply across the shoulders, and the scrambling boys were hissed at as they rushed outside into the dusk, bumping into boys from other huts, and under the flying sticks were herded with gruff orders into a ragged line, each boy grasping the hand of the boy ahead. When they all were in place, the Kintango fixed them with a dark scowl, and announced that they were about to undertake a night journey deep into the surrounding forest. At the order to march, a long line of boys set out along the path in clumsy disarray, and the sticks fell steadily among them. "You walk like buffalo," Kunta heard close to his ear. A boy cried out as he was hit, and both assistants shouted loudly in the darkness, "Who was that?" and their sticks rained down even harder. After that no boy uttered a sound. Kunta's legs soon began to hurt, but not as soon or as badly as they would have done if he hadn't learned the manner of loose striding taught him by his father on their trip to the village of Jannah and Saloum. It pleased him to think that the other boys' legs were surely hurting worse than his, for they wouldn't yet know how to walk. But nothing he had learned did anything to help Kunta's hunger and thirst. His stomach felt tied in knots, and he was starting to feel light-headed when at last a stop was called near a small stream. The reflection of the bright moon in its surface was soon set to rippling, as the boys fell to their knees and began to scoop up and gulp down handfuls of water. A moment later the Kintango's assistants commanded them away from the stream with orders not to drink too much at once, then opened their head packs and passed out some chunks of dried meat. The boys tore away at the morsels like hyenas. Kunta chewed and swallowed so fast that he barely tasted the 4 bites he managed to wrestle away for himself. Every boy's feet had big, raw blisters on them, Kunta's as bad as any of the rest, but it felt so good to have food and water in his stomach that he hardly noticed. As they sat by the stream, he and his Kafo mates began to look around in the moonlight at one another, this time too tired rather than too afraid to speak. Kunta and Sitafa exchanged long glances, but neither could tell in the dim light if his friend looked as miserable as he felt himself. Kunta hardly had a chance to cool his burning feet in the stream before the Kintango's assistants ordered them back into formation for the long walk back to Jujuo. His legs and head were numb when they finally came within sight of the bamboo gates shortly before dawn. Feeling ready to die, he trudged to his hut, bumped into another boy already inside, lost his footing, stumbled to the dirt floor, and fell deep asleep right where he lay. On every night for the next 6 nights came another march, each one longer than the last. The pain of his blistered feet was terrible, but Kunta found by the 4th night that he somehow didn't mind the pain as much, and he began to feel a welcome new emotion, pride. By the 6th march, he and the other boys discovered that though the night was very dark, they no longer needed to hold the next boy's hand in order to maintain a straight marching line. On the 7th night came the Kintango's first personal lesson for the boys, showing them how men deep in the forest used the stars to guide them, so that they would never be lost. Within the first half moon, every boy of the Kafo had learned how to lead the marching line by the stars, back toward the Jujuo. One night, when Kunta was the leader, he almost stepped on a bush rat before it noticed him and scurried for cover. Kunta was almost as proud as he was startled, for this meant that the marchers had been walking too silently to be heard even by an animal. But animals, the Kintango told them, were the best teachers of the art of hunting, which was one of the most important things for any Mandinka to learn. When the Kintango was satisfied that they had mastered the techniques of marching, he told the Kafo, for the next half moon, deep into the bush far from the Jujuo, where they built lean-to shelters to sleep in between countless lessons in the secrets of becoming a Simban. Kunta's eyes never seemed to have been closed before one of the Kintango's assistants was shouting them awake for some training session. The Contango's assistants pointed out where lions had recently crouched in wait. The Contango's assistants pointed out where lions had recently crouched in wait, then sprung out to kill passing antelope, then where the lions had gone after their meal and laid down to sleep for the rest of the night. The tracks of the antelope herd were followed backward until they almost painted a picture for the boys of what those antelope had done through the day before they met the lions. The Kafo inspected the wide cracks in rocks where wolves and hyenas hid, and they began to learn many tricks of hunting that they had never dreamed about. They never had realized, for example, that the first secret of the master Simban was never moving abruptly. The old Contango himself told the boys a story about a foolish hunter who finally starved to death in an area thick with game because he was so clumsy and made so much noise, darting here and there, that all about him animals of every sort swiftly and silently slipped away without his even realizing that any had been near. The boys felt like that clumsy hunter during their lessons in imitating the sounds of animals and birds. The air was rent with their grunts and whistles, yet no birds or animals came near. Then they would be told to lie very quietly in hiding places while the Contango and his assistants made what seemed to them the same sounds. And soon animals and birds would come into sight, cocking their heads and looking for the others who had called to them. When the boys were practicing bird calls one afternoon, suddenly a large-bodied, heavy-beaked bird landed with a great squawking in a nearby bush. "Look!" one boy shouted with a loud laugh, and every other boy's heart leapt into his throat, knowing that once again that boy's big mouth was going to get them all punished together. No few times before had he shown his habit of acting before thinking, but now the Contango surprised them. He walked over to the boy and said to him very sternly, "Bring that bird to me, alive." Kunta and his mates held their breaths as they watched the boy hunch down and creep towards the bush where the heavy bird sat stupidly, turning its head this way and that. But when the boy sprang, the bird managed to escape his clutching hands, frantically beating its stubby wings just enough to raise its big body over the brush tops, and the boy went leaping after it in hot pursuit, soon disappearing from sight. Kunta and the others were thunderstruck. There was clearly no limit to what the Contango might order them to do. For the next 3 days and 2 nights, as the boys went about their training sessions, they cast long glances at each other and then the nearby bush, all of them wondering and worrying about what had befallen their missing mate. As much as he had annoyed them before by getting them all beaten for things he'd done, he seemed never more one of them now that he was gone. The boys were just getting up on the morning of the 4th day when the Jujuo lookout signaled that someone was approaching the village. A moment later came the drum message. It was he. They rushed out to meet him, whooping as if their own brother had returned from a trek to Marrakech. Thin and dirty and covered with cuts and bruises, he swayed slightly as they ran up and slapped him on the back, but he managed a weak smile, and well he should. Under his arm, its wings and feet and beak bound with a length of vine, he held the bird. It looked even worse than he did, but it was still alive. The Contango came out, and though speaking to that boy, he made it clear that he was really speaking to them all. This taught you 2 important things: to do as you are told, and to keep your mouth shut. These are among the makings of men. Then Kunta and his mates saw that boy receive the first clearly approving look cast upon anyone by the old Contango. who had known that the boy would sooner or later be able to catch a bird so heavy that it could make only short, low hops through the bush. The big bird was quickly roasted and eaten with great relish by everyone except his captor, who was so tired that he couldn't stay awake long enough for it to cook. He was permitted to sleep through the day and also through the night, which Kunta and the others had to spend out in the bush on a hunting lesson. The next day, during the first rest period, the boys told his hushed mates what a torturous chase he had led, until finally, after 2 days and a night, he had laid a trap that the bird walked into. After trussing it up, including the snapping beak, he had somehow kept himself awake for another day and night, and by following the stars as they had been taught, he found his way back to the Jujuo. For a while after that, the other boys had very little to say to him. Kunta told himself that he wasn't really jealous. It was just that the boys seemed to think that his exploit, and the Kintango's approval of it, had made him more important than his Kafo mates. And the very next time the Kintango's assistants ordered an afternoon of wrestling practice, Kunta seized the chance to grab that boy and throw him roughly to the ground. By the second moon of manhood training, Kunta's Kafo had become almost as skilled at survival in the forest as they would have been in their own village. They could now both detect and follow the all but invisible signs of animals, and now they were learning the secret rituals and prayers of the forefathers that could make a very great Simbon himself invisible to animals. Every bite of meat they ate now was either trapped by the boys or shot by their slings and arrows. They could skin an animal twice as fast as they could before, and cook the meat over the nearly smokeless fires they had learned to build by striking flint close to dry moss under light, dry sticks. Their meals of roasted game, sometimes small bush rats, were usually topped off with insects toasted crispy in the coals. Some of the most valuable lessons they learned weren't even planned. One day, during a rest period, when a boy was testing his bow and one careless arrow happened to strike a nest of Kuruburungo bees high in a tree, a cloud of angry bees swarmed down. And once again all the boys suffered for the mistake of one. Not even the fastest runner among them escaped the painful stings. The Simbon never shoots an arrow without knowing what it will hit, the Kintango told them later. Ordering the boys to rub one another's puffed and hurting places with shea tree butter, he said, "Tonight you will deal with those bees in the proper manner." By nightfall, the boys had piled dry moss beneath the tree that had held the nest. After one of the Kintango's assistants set it afire, the other one threw into the flames a quantity of leaves from a certain bush. Thick, choking smoke rose into the tree's upper limbs, and soon dead bees were dropping around the boys by the thousands, as harmlessly as rain. In the morning, Kunta and his Kafo were shown how to melt down the honeycombs, skimming off the rest of the dead bees, so that they could eat their fill of honey. Kunta could almost feel himself tingle with that extra strength that it was said honey would give to great hunters when they were in need of quick nourishment deep in the forest. But no matter what they went through, no matter how much they added to their knowledge and abilities, the old Kintango was never satisfied. His demands and his discipline remained so strict that the boys were torn between fear and anger most of the time. When they weren't too weary to feel either. Any command to one boy that wasn't instantly and perfectly performed still brought a beating to the entire kafo, and when they weren't being beaten, it seemed to Kunta, they were being wakened roughly in the middle of the night for a long march, always as a punishment for some boy's wrongdoing. The only thing that kept Kunta and the others from giving that boy a beating of their own was the certain knowledge that they would be beaten for fighting, among the first lessons they had learned in life, long before coming to the Jujuo, having been that Mandinkas must never fight among themselves. Finally, the boys began to understand that the welfare of the group depended on each of them, just as the welfare of their tribe would depend on each of them one day. Violations of the rules slowly dwindled to an occasional lapse, and with the decline in beatings, the fear they felt for the Kintango was slowly replaced by a respect they felt before only for their fathers. But still hardly a day would pass without something new to make Kunta and his mates feel awkward and ignorant all over again. It amazed them to learn, for example, that a rag folded and hung in certain ways near a man's hut would inform other Mandinka men when he planned to return. Or that sandals crossed in certain ways outside a hut told many things that only other men would understand. But the secret Kunta found the most remarkable of all was Sirakango, a kind of men's talk in which sounds of Mandinka words were changed in such a way that no women or children or non-Mandinkas were permitted to learn. Kunta remembered times when he had heard his father say something very rapidly to another man that Kunta had not understood nor dared to ask explained. Now that he had learned it himself, he and his mates soon spoke nearly everything they said in the secret talk of men. In every hut, as each moon went by, the boys added a new rock to a bowl to mark how long they had been gone from Jafur. Within days after the third rock was dropped in the bowl, the boys were wrestling in the compound one afternoon when suddenly they looked toward the gate of the Jujuo, and there stood a group of 25 or 30 men. A loud gasp rose from the boys as they recognized their fathers, uncles, and older brothers. Kunta sprang up, unable to believe his eyes, as a bolt of joy shot through him at the first sight of a Moro for 3 moons. But it was as if some unseen hand held him back and stifled a cry of gladness. Even before he saw in his father's face no sign that he recognized his son. Only one boy rushed forward, calling out his father's name, and without a word that father reached for the stick of the nearest Kintango's assistant and beat his son with it, shouting at him harshly for betraying his emotions, for showing that he was still a boy. He added, unnecessarily, as he gave him the last licks, that his son should expect no favors from his father. Then the Kintango himself barked a command for the entire kafo to lie on their bellies in a row, and all of the visiting men walked along the row and flailed the upturned backsides with their walking sticks. Kunta's emotions were in a turmoil. The blows he didn't mind at all, knowing them to be merely another of the rigors of manhood training, but it pained him not to be able to hug his father or even hear his voice, and it shamed him to know that it wasn't manly even to wish for such indulgences. The beating over, the Kintango ordered the boys to race, to jump, to dance, to wrestle, to pray as they had been taught, and the fathers, uncles, and older brothers watched it all silently, and then departed with warm compliments to the Kintango and his assistants, but not so much as a backward look at the boys, who stood with downcast faces. Within the hour, they got another beating for sulking about the preparation of their evening meal. It hurt all the more because the Kintango and his assistants acted as if the visitors had never even been there. But early that night, while the boys were wrestling before bedtime, only half-heartedly now, one of the Kintango's assistants passed by Kunta and said brusquely to him, under his breath, "You have a new brother, and he is named Madi." 4 of us now, thought Kunta, lying awake later that night. 4 brothers, 4 sons for his mother and father. He thought how they would sound in the Kinti family history when it was told by griots for hundreds of reigns in the future. After Amoro, thought Kunta, he would be the first man of the family when he returned to Jafur. Not only was he learning to be a man, but he was also learning many, many things he would be able to teach Lamin, as already he had taught him so many of the things of boyhood. At least he would teach him that which was permissible for boys to know, and then Lamin would teach Suwadu, and Suwadu would teach this new one whom Kunta had not even seen, whose name was Madi. And some day, Kunta thought as he drifted off to sleep, when he was as old as Amoro, he would have sons of his own, and it would all begin again. Chapter 24. You are ceasing to be children. You are experiencing rebirth as men, the Kintango said one morning to the assembled Kafo. This was the first time the Kintango had used the word men except to tell them what they weren't. After moons of learning together, working together, being beaten together, he told them. Each of them was finally beginning to discover that he had 2 selves. One within him, and the other, larger self in all those whose blood and lives he shared. Not until they learned that lesson could they undertake the next phase of manhood training, how to be warriors. You know already that Mandinkas fight only if others are warlike, said the Kintango, but we are the finest warriors if driven to fight. For the next half-moon, Kunta and his mates learned how to make war. Famous Mandinka battle strategies were drawn in the dust by the Kintango or his assistants, and then the boys were told to reenact the strategies in mock battles. Never completely encircle your enemy, counseled the Kintango. Leave him some escape, for he will fight even more desperately if trapped. The boys learned also that battles should start in late afternoon, so that any enemy, seeing defeat, could save face by retreating in the darkness. And they were taught that during any wars, neither enemy should ever do harm to any traveling marabouts, griots, or blacksmiths, for an angered marabout could bring down the displeasure of Allah. An angered griot could use his eloquent tongue to stir the enemy army to greater savagery, and an angered blacksmith could make or repair weapons for the enemy. Under the direction of the Kintango's assistants, Kunta and the others carved out barbed spears and made barbed arrows of the kind used only in battle, and practiced with them on smaller and smaller targets. When a boy could hit a bamboo cane 25 steps away, he was cheered and praised. Tramping into the woods, the boys found some kuna shrub, whose leaves they picked to be boiled back at the jujuo. Into the resulting thick, black juice they would dip a cotton thread, and they were shown how that thread, wound around an arrow's barbs, would seep a deadly poison into whatever wound the arrow made. At the end of the war training period, the Kintango told them more than they had ever known before, and told them more excitingly than they had ever heard it, about the greatest of all Mandinka wars and warriors, the time when the army of the fabled ex-slave general Sundiata son of Sogolan, the buffalo woman, conquered the forces of the Boer country's King Sumaro, a king so cruel that he wore human skin robes and adorned his palace walls with enemies' bleached skulls. Kunta and his mates held their breaths, hearing how both armies suffered thousands of wounded or dead. But the archers of the Mandinkas closed in on Sumwaro's forces like a giant trap, raining down arrows from both sides, and moving in steadily until Sumwaro's terrified army finally fled in rout. For days and nights, said the Kintango, and it was the first time the boys ever had seen him smile, the talking drums of every village followed the marching progress of the victorious Mandinka forces, laden with enemy booty and driving thousands of captives before them. In every village, happy crowds jeered and kicked the prisoners, whose shaved heads were bowed and whose hands were tied behind their backs. Finally, General Sundiata called a huge meeting of the people, and he brought before them the chiefs of all the villagers he had defeated, and gave them back their spears of chiefhood's rank, and then he established among those chiefs the bonds of peace, which would last among them for the next 100 reigns. Kunta and his mates went dreamily to their beds, never prouder to be Mandinkas. As the next moon of training began, drum talk reached the Jujuo telling of new visitors to be expected within the next 2 days. The excitement with which the news of any visitors would have been received, after so long since the fathers and brothers had come to see them, was doubled when the boys learned that the sender of the message was the drummer of Jafur's champion wrestling team, which was coming to conduct special lessons for the trainees. Late in the afternoon of the next day, the drums announced their arrival even earlier than expected, but the boys' pleasure at seeing all the familiar faces again was forgotten when, without a word, the wrestlers grabbed them and began to flip them onto the ground harder than they had ever been thrown in their lives. And every boy was bruised and hurting when the wrestlers divided them into smaller groups to grapple one another, as the champions supervised. Kunta had never imagined there were so many wrestling holds, nor how effectively they could work if used correctly. And the champions kept drumming into the boys' ears that it was knowledge and expertness and not strength that made the difference between being an ordinary wrestler and a champion. Still, as they demonstrated the holds for their pupils, the boys couldn't help admiring their bulging muscles as much as their skill in using them. Around the fire that night, the drummer from Jafur chanted the names of the feats of great Mandinka wrestling champions of even 100 reigns in the past, and when it was the boys' time for bed, the wrestlers left the Jujuo to return to Jafur. 2 days later came news of another visitor. This time, the message was brought by a runner from Jafur, a young man of the 4th Kafo whom Kunta and his mates knew well, though in his own new manhood he acted as if he never had seen these 3rd Kafo children. Without so much as a glance at them, he ran up to the Kintango and announced, between deep breaths, that Kujali Njai, a griot well known throughout the Gambia, would soon spend 1 full day at the Jujuo. In 3 days he arrived, accompanied by several young men of his family. He was much older than any of the griots Kunta had seen before, so old, in fact, that he made the Kintango seem young. After gesturing for the boys to squat in a semicircle about him, the old man began to talk of how he became what he was. He told them how, over years of studying from young manhood, every griot had buried deep in his mind the records of the ancestors. How else could you know the great deeds of the ancient kings, holy men, hunters, and warriors who came hundreds of reigns before us? Have you met them? asked the old man. No, the history of our people is carried to the future in here, and he tapped his gray head. The question in the mind of every boy was answered by the old griot. Only the sons of griots could become griots. Indeed, it was their solemn duty to become griots. Upon finishing their manhood training, these boys, like those grandsons of his own who sat beside him here today, would begin studying and traveling with selected elders, hearing over and again the historical names and stories as they had been passed down. And in due time, each young man would know that special part of the forefathers' history in the finest and fullest detail, just as it had been told to his father and his father's father. And the day would come when that boy would become a man and have sons to whom he would tell those stories, so that the events of the distant past would forever live. When the odd boys had wolfed down their evening meal and rushed back to gather again around the old griot, he thrilled them until late into the night with stories his own father had passed down to him, about the great black empires that had ruled Africa hundreds of reigns before. Long before Toubab ever put his foot in Africa, the old griot said, there was the empire of Benin, ruled by an all-powerful king called the Oba, whose every wish was obeyed instantly. But the actual governing of Benin was done by trusted counselors of the Oba, whose full time was needed just for making the necessary sacrifices to appease the forces of evil and for his proper attentions to a harem of more than 100 wives. But even before Benin was a yet richer kingdom called Songhai, said the griot. Songhai's capital city was Gao, filled with fine houses for black princes and rich merchants who lavishly entertained traveling tradesmen who brought much gold to buy goods. Nor was that the richest kingdom, said the old man, and he told the boys of ancestral Ghana, in which an entire town was populated with only the king's court, and King Kanisai had 1,000 horses, each of which had 3 servants and its own urinal made of copper. Kunta could hardly believe his ears. And each evening, said the griot, when King Kanisai would emerge from his palace, 1,000 fires would be lit, lighting up all between the heavens and the earth. And the servants of the great king would bring forth food enough to serve the 10,000 people who gathered there each evening. Here he paused, and exclamations of wonder could not be restrained by the boys, who knew well that no sound should be made as a griot talked, but neither he nor even the Kintango himself seemed to notice their rudeness. Putting into his mouth half of a kola nut and offering the other half to the Kintango, who accepted it with pleasure, the griot drew the skirt of his robe closer about his legs against the chill of the early night and resumed his stories. But even Ghana was not the richest black kingdom, he exclaimed. The very richest, the very oldest of them all, was the kingdom of ancient Mali. Like the other empires, Mali had its cities, its farmers, its artisans, its blacksmiths, tanners, dyers, and weavers, said the old griot. But Mali's enormous wealth came from its far-flung trade routes in salt and gold and copper. Altogether, Mali was 4 months of travel long and 4 months of travel wide, said the griot, and the greatest of all its cities was the fabled Timbuktu, the major center of learning in all Africa. It was populated by thousands of scholars, made even more numerous by a steady parade of visiting wise men, seeking to increase their knowledge, so many that some of the biggest merchants sold nothing but parchments and books. There is not a marabout, not a teacher in the smallest village, whose knowledge has not come, at least in part, from Timbuktu, said the griot. When finally the Contango stood up and thanked the griot for the generosity with which he had shared with them the treasures of his mind, Kunta and the others, for the first time since they came to the Jujuo, actually dared to voice their displeasure, for the time had come for them to go to bed. The Contango chose to ignore this impertinence, at least for the time being, and sternly commanded them to their huts, but not before they had a chance to beg him to urge the griot to come back and visit them again. They were still thinking and talking of the wondrous tales the griot had told them when, 6 days later, word came that a famous Moro would soon be visiting the camp. The Moro was the highest grade of teacher in the Gambia. Indeed, there were only a few of them, and so wise were they, after many reigns of study, that their job was to teach not schoolboys but other teachers, such as the Arafang of Jafur. Even the Contango showed unusual concern about this visitor, ordering the entire Jujuo to be thoroughly cleaned, with the dirt raked and then brushed with leafy branches to a smoothness that would capture the honor of the fresh footprints of the Moro when he arrived. Then the Contango assembled the boys in the compound and told them, "The advice and the blessings of this man who will be with us is sought not only by ordinary people, but also by village chiefs and even by kings." When the Moro arrived the next morning, 5 of his students were with him, each carrying head bundles that Kunta knew would contain treasured Arabic books and parchment manuscripts, such as those from ancient Timbuktu. As the old man passed through the gate, Kunta and his mates joined the Contango and his assistants on their knees, with their foreheads touching the ground. When the Moro had blessed them and their Jujuo, they rose and seated themselves respectfully around him as he opened his books and began to read, first from the Quran, then from such unheard-of books as the Torita la Musa, the Zabura Dawidi, and the Lingih la Isa, which he said were known to Christians as the Pentateuch of Moses, the Psalms of David, and the Book of Isaiah. Each time the Moro would open or close a book, roll or unroll a manuscript, he would press it to his forehead and mutter, "Amen." When he had finished reading, the old man put his books aside and spoke to them of great events and people from the Christian Quran, which was known as the Holy Bible. He spoke of Adam and Eve, of Joseph and his brethren, of Moses, David, and Solomon, of the death of Abel. And he spoke to them of great men, of more recent history, such as Julu Karanaini, known to the Tubab as Alexander the Great, a mighty king of gold and silver whose sun had shone over half the world. Before the Moro finally rose to leave that night, he reviewed what they already knew of the 5 daily prayers to Allah, and he instructed them thoroughly in how to conduct themselves inside the sacred mosque of their village, which they would enter for the first time when they returned home as men. Then he and his students had to hurry in order to reach the next place on his busy schedule, and the boys honored him, as the Contango had instructed them, by singing one of the men's songs they had learned from the Jalikia. One generation passes on, another generation comes and goes, but Allah abides forever. In his hut after the Moro had gone that night, Kunta lay awake thinking how so many things, indeed nearly everything they had learned, all tied together. The past seemed with the present with the future, the dead with the living, and those yet to be born. He himself with his family, his mates, his village, his tribe, his Africa, the world of man with the world of animals and growing things. They all lived with Allah. Kunta felt very small, yet very large. Perhaps, he thought, this is what it means to become a man.